If you could unmute yourself first.
Sorry, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much, Aymen, for the introduction. I'm just going to pull up my slides here so that we can at least get my introduction started. I know it is a little bit late in the day, so I appreciate everyone being online. I am going to ask today that you actually do engage and interact with this session. I have a few questions that I'm going to be asking you, and some, since this is on the topic of assessments, I'm going to be assessing you a little bit on a few questions. So I would really appreciate it if you could actually interact. I know some people are probably using their mobile phones, so I will give you a couple different options to participate. Before we get started and I do anything else, can I just check to make sure that everyone is able to use the chat box? I saw a few people, Duha, looked like Marouge already used the chat boxes. If everyone else could just put something, some kind of comment, say hello, introduce yourselves into the chat box, that would be great. Thank you, Radwan. Thank you, Timothy. Perfect. Thank you, Dalal. That's great. So easiest way to interact today will be to use the chat box. If you're able to have a second device that has a connection to the internet, I have a few QR codes that I'm going to be showing throughout the session. You can scan the QR codes to participate. If you are on the same device that you are, you only have one device, I will give you another option to participate and send the hyperlink into this chat box. So we have plenty of different options for you to interact today. All right, fantastic. Thank you everyone for putting that into the chat box. Now, as Aymen said, I am currently studying the use of psychometric assessments in the GCC, primarily in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, as that's where I was working and where I have a lot of clients. But I do have a lot of experience using psychometrics in many different areas. I've used them as a practitioner, supplying them to my clients and using them to guide them through developmental opportunities. And I've also taken them myself. I've participated in many psychometric assessments throughout my career. As Aymen mentioned, I do have 7 years working in the Gulf region. I've visited every country in the Gulf. I have, a lot of experience working with different people within that region, but I am continuing to learn about the ways that psychometric assessments might be a little bit different in the region. So that's what we'll be exploring a bit today. My studies are almost concluding. I should be defending my dissertation within the coming months and hopefully be rewarded with my certification, but I'm still working through my doctoral research right now. I put a note on here in my introduction that I am a fanatic reader. I always love to tell people when I meet them that I love to read, and I always welcome suggestions or recommendations on books. It's a great way to connect. I love to learn and I love to connect with people through books. So I'm just going to put that out there in case anyone, thinks of a topic that might be interesting for me or would like to share with the group. You are, I know many people in this room are experts in different areas. So we'd love to learn from you, and you're welcome to share those suggestions in the chat box throughout the session. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to see if everyone is able to use the annotation feature. If you're on a cell phone, usually the annotation feature looks like a little pencil mark, and it's somewhere towards the bottom of your screen. If you're using a computer, it may be up at the top. So I'm just going to use an example here of the drawing feature. I'm just going to invite you, if you could mark on the screen. I just want to test to see if you're able to use this. The few activities that we can use that tool. Okay, I see that someone's found it. That's great. If not, if I ask a question that uses the annotation feature, you're always welcome to use the chat box to participate. Okay, I see a couple of people found it. Thank you. Should look like a pencil, maybe a pen. It could be at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on the device that you're using. See a few new people are finding it. Thank you, Dalal. Can't always see everyone's name. And also will put your attention to the QR code at the top of the screen. If you want to go ahead and just test that out, that's just a link to my website, but we'll be using some interactive quizzes throughout the session. So I just want to make sure that you have a QR code reader that will accept those so that you can participate in the activities as we move forward. So that's at the top right of the screen. And as I mentioned, I will put the direct link in to the chat box if you're only on one device and need access to that. And at any time, if you have a question, we will do a Q&A session at the end, but feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat box, and I will try and address them as we go. If I'm unable to address them, I may wait until the end of the session to respond to them, but keep that open as a dialogue and feel free to ask me to repeat something or ask a question along the way. All right, fantastic. Thanks for trying out those tools with me. I'm just going to clear them for now. That way we have a nice open screen. And what I want to just get your mind thinking about is this actual term that we've been using a few times, psychometrics or psychometric measures. I'm curious how many people are really familiar with psychometrics, if you've ever taken them, if you've ever used them at work or in some capacity for a job. I'd love to just see your responses in the chat box here. What is your familiarity with psychometric measures or psychometric assessments? If you know a lot, tell me you're an expert. If you don't know very much, tell me you're curious and learning. You can put whatever whatever comes to mind in the chat box here. Let me know your familiarity with psychometrics. This helps me to really set the stage and understand. Great, Norman, administer them at scalable. Okay, fantastic. Okay, great. Great. All right. So I see a few names there. DISC and Strengths Finders. Have used some. Use at the organization. Often use them for hiring and promotion. Okay. Thank you, Mohammed. I see quite a lot of familiarity so far in the chat box. And the term psychometric isn't always used. And sometimes you might hear some different terms for this. So I'll be breaking that down in the next few slides. We use them for hiring. Okay. Fantastic. Great, Duha. We will be certainly talking about them. So, I would say probably 10 years ago, I was very much the same. I was regularly using psychometrics. I was engaging with them, sometimes as a candidate for different jobs and sometimes in my roles within HR and training and development. A lot of use, but to be honest, I didn't have a great level of understanding of how these assessments were really put together and how they could best be used. So I'm going to be sharing that with you today. I'll share with you what I've learned in my doctoral research about the use of some of these psychometric tools in Saudi and Bahrain. And really my hope is that by the end of this session, you'll feel a little bit more informed and very empowered when it comes to using these types of tools for your business. I do have a QR code on this slide. If you would like to scan that, I just have one quick question to ask you about your interest in using psychometrics for your business. For some people, this may not be of interest. For others, it might be of great interest. I'm just curious to know. And the value of this voting is you'll be able to see what everyone else in the room is interested in as well. You'll be able to see those results. So just kind of gives you a sense of other people's interest level that you're in the room with today. So I'll just give you a moment to use that. About 75 to 80% of large companies that are marked as, Fortune 500 companies or great places to work, pretty much any list you go on with reputable companies, about 75 to 80% of them are using psychometrics today. And as were mentioned, Dalal said it's used for hiring. Yes, I'm so sorry. Let me get that link in there. For some people, it's for hiring. For some people, it's for promotions. There's some other opportunities as well to use them for even developmental maybe you have a skill that you would like to develop. Psychometrics can be used for that as well. So lots of different uses. Let me just get this in here. There you go. Okay, so hopefully you can see that link. Thank you for reminding me of that. I'll make sure to do that for the next couple of questions. I just have a few more that will be using that. So as you're continuing to take that, feel free to continue to respond to that. But I want to show you just a few of the bucket terms that are used for psychometric assessments. Sometimes we think of them as IQ tests or cognitive tests or measuring some other type of attribute. So we might be measuring something like emotional intelligence, or we might be measuring something to do with judgment, our decision-making skills. There's a lot of situational judgment type questions. And one that was mentioned, I heard DISC, I heard strengths finders. Those really fall more into the category of personality assessments. And those are often used in business settings. And you see them all around. You might see them on LinkedIn, you might see a link for them, or even on other social media platforms. You'll see a lot of opportunities to engage with these types of assessment. Now, as I mentioned, they're used in 75 to 80% of companies for recruiting, promotion, or personal development. And there is a wide variety of tools out there. Some of them are very rigorous. They have been studied academically. They have been used around the world. They are translated into many different languages. And, they've been around for a long time. However, there are other assessments out there that are new. Some of them are not very rigorous. The design behind them is not always shared. I've been doing a lot of research trying to understand the methodology that these companies are using in their psychometric measures. And I have either had to sign non-disclosure agreements in order to be able to find out how they have actually put together their methodology, or they never tell me. Some of it is kept very secret and could be obviously because these organizations are making a lot of money using these psychometric assessments, and they want to be able to keep that proprietary so that other companies can't copy their methods. But sometimes there is limited access to users of these assessments as far as how they were created and who they've been tested against. So, I'll share along the way some of my findings, and I've also conducted research with professionals in Saudi and Bahrain, and I'll be sharing a few of those findings as well, and just what I found about how those assessments actually work in the GCC. So I do want to put a disclosure out there that I am not an expert in all psychometrics. I do not work exclusively with one company that provides psychometrics. I have used a variety. I recommend a variety to my clients, and I'm not going to promote any of them today. I want to show just a couple other names here, just in case you're still thinking what's really a psychometric, and maybe have I seen any of these before. There's a list of a few maybe brands or logos that you may be aware of along the bottom of the screen. I'm not here to celebrate or criticize any of these names specifically. I am simply wanting to share my perspective and my insights that are gained from a very unique type of research. A lot of these assessments are gathering quantitative data. They're asking people questions, and then they're looking at the answers to those questions and making sure that they're statistically sound, that the responses are falling within a normal range that we would expect from any person compared to another person. My work is really figuring out how people understand and why they respond to psychometrics the way that they do. And so that's what I'll be sharing from that perspective today. So, as I said, there is a range of assessments out there, and the best of the best are going to have claims such as this. Psychometric assessment should be objective, meaning that the person who has put together the assessment or the person giving the assessment should not be influencing the responses. They should be unbiased, and anyone who takes the assessment should have the same opportunity to score, a high score or desirable score or a fair, accurate score. They should also be standardized, meaning that the test should be consistent. If we're giving it around the world, we should see consistent results. We shouldn't see anomalies in one place versus another place. We can, as I said, they should be statistically sound, and the distribution should be what we expect. That also means that the testing environment should be controlled, meaning people, if they're supposed to be able to use paper and pen when they're taking the test, as scratch paper or side paper, they have access to that. Or if they can only use the computer that's in front of them, there should be no ability for them to cheat or take a look at other resources while they're taking the assessment. They should also be reliable, meaning that we could replicate these scores. You'll probably hear some assessment companies say, if you take our test today and you take it 5 years from now, you should get a pretty similar response. Or pretty similar score, because these are reliable. They're not going to change over time. We have a lot of measures in place to make sure that they are consistent over time. I would say probably the biggest selling point is that these types of assessments are meant to be predictive. And what we hear is, if you use a cognitive test for hiring, you will ensure that you have higher level performers coming into your organization. If you are, looking at using it for promotional services, you would be expected to, a year from now, after promoting someone, you would be able to see, yes, they were in fact capable of this job. Their tests predicted their good performance. And finally, the tests should be unbiased, meaning that they are not discriminate toward any race, age, or gender, ethnicity, anything like that. So that's a really great question. I just saw it in the chat box. Are the tests sensitive to different cultures? That's actually where my interest comes in, because when I first moved to Bahrain back in 2015, and I expected that I would have access to tests and assessments and tools that I had never seen before when I was working in the US. But what I discovered was that most of the tests that I was using in the GCC came from America, or they came from the West. And so I was curious about the very same thing, which is really the focus of my research is, do these tests really translate to different cultures? What I have found is that many of the tests are translated, and so the language is suitable. They're not all just in English. There's translated versions of these assessments available. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are sensitive to different cultures. So that's something that we'll be addressing today. I think there is another comment that's in Arabic. I apologize that I cannot read that, but if there is anything that you want to ask me, I'm happy to answer that. Yeah, really interesting. People do grow and mature, especially if they've had life-changing experiences. When that lead to different results? Yeah, kind of the standard answer that you might hear is that your score should be close. You shouldn't be the direct opposite of what you scored, let's say when you were 20 and you take another test when you're 40. Most people are not going to go all the way to the other side of that spectrum. We would expect to see some shifts, because you're exactly right, people mature. I know personally, when I've taken some assessments, it depends on the job that I'm in. It depends on the context. What I'm thinking about when I answer the questions, I might answer in a slightly different way. If I'm in a leadership position, I might answer in a different way than if I'm an individual contributor. So we would likely see some of those changes, but as I said, the promise is they're not going to be completely different. They should be somewhat reliable, so that you would expect to see those natural shifts, but not an opposite score. Yeah, great comments and questions. Keep those coming. So actually, before I show that, I want to make sure that you have the access to the to your phone to do the QR code. I'm also going to grab a link for you to put that into the box, because I want to show you a couple of these test questions. I want to just kind of explore them on a few different topics and just see what you think. Let's talk through them. Let's talk through some of the challenges and maybe talk about how those might be different, when it comes to different cultures. So let me just pull this up and get you access to the link. Okay, I put the link in the box, but there is also a QR code on the screen. I'm not going to read this. I'd like for you to just take a look at it. This is an example of a cognitive test question. So go ahead and scan the code, or you can use the link in the box, answer the question, and click on vote. That way the vote is submitted, and then you should be able to see the responses.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
I'm not speaking now. I was just giving a moment. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So I see Marush said there is no question. I just tested the link and the QR code and it's working for me. So is anyone else able to answer the question?
The question
There's
is
an answer,
on the
but
slide, yeah.
It's not a question. There's a set of answers without a question.
On the slide itself? Do you see
No,
where it
on the
says John
site.
wants? Yeah, yeah. So the question is on the slide. John wants to send a letter to Peter who lives
Okay,
on
clear.
Tesla Street. And you'll see A, B, C, D, E, and F. Yeah, sorry about that. So that all of the actual choices are on the screen. You just need to select the answer that's on the QR code. Yeah, thank you, Dalal. So just give them another moment. Okay, I see 5 responses so far. I don't want to pressure you, so I'm just going to give another minute. Okay, and I know some people may be watching this recording later, so I do want to encourage people to take a look at the question, just submit their answers so that you can see the results from other people just before we move forward. Those of you who have answered, or if you're still working on it, I'd just love to hear from you in the chat box. What do you feel about this question? How did it feel for you to answer it? Any perceptions of the question coming to your mind? This was taken from a real assessment that I actually just took about 2 months ago. So it's very new and it's on a widely used cognitive test that's available for hiring. So anyone have any thoughts about this question? No right or wrong answer here. No relation between the information given and the question. Okay. Each of us has a understanding or explanation of the wording. Okay. It's an interesting thought as well. What other thoughts on this? Did anyone feel any kind of pressure when you were taking a look at this question, or any kind of confusion? These types of word problems are very common in cognitive tests. It's one of many different types. You may have seen some kind of cognitive tests that have pattern recognition, where you're looking at different shapes, or you're trying to find irregularities. It's a tricky one. Yeah. I agree, Duha. Okay, I'm gonna keep these coming to be quiet for a moment. It's culturally biased. For many years, there were no house numbers in many places, including Saudi. Yeah, that's a really interesting. That was one of the first things that I thought too when I saw this question. And I'm probably a little bit more primed to looking for cultural biases because that's been my focus. But yeah, you will see a lot of times as much as these test creators attempt to make assessments culturally unbiased, sometimes they can't even see outside of their own cultural lens. And even, the names here, John and Peter, are maybe very common names in the US or the UK, other parts of the world. But seeing these types of names when you're taking the assessment in another part of the world can create some dissonance. You have some separation from the question. It just doesn't maybe relate as much as it might relate to someone who's very familiar with these names. So, those are other things that we can look for. You can make a message if you were to choose. Yeah. Yeah, so, this is just one example. As I said, many of the kind of cognitive tests focus on things like pattern recognition, short-term memory. You'll see visual and spatial processing, or reasoning and logic, which would be what we were looking at in that previous question. You actually have to do some mathematical equations to figure out that answer. And I'm looking at the scores here. It looks like we have 11 people who responded, and there's a really wide variety of responses. A lot of people chose A and B, but we have answers in every of the statements except for F. So, we got a wide distribution of responses there. And I don't know how confident anyone was in their responses, but, one of the challenges with these kinds of cognitive assessments is that they do produce a great deal of anxiety in test takers, especially people who are not familiar with these types of assessments. In some parts of the world, we're very, very familiar with standardized tests. We do a lot of multiple choice. We're familiar with deductive reasoning and looking at different ways of taking assessments. And so we might be very familiar with this type of question. Other places, other parts of the world may not have that familiarity. And there are a lot of people out there who get very anxious when they take tests. Most cognitive tests are timed, and the faster you answer the questions accurately, the higher you are placed on the scale when it comes to intelligence or cognitive capabilities. So that can also be very tough for people. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are not intelligent. It may just mean that you have some challenges when it comes to taking these types of assessments, understanding the questions, breaking down the statements, especially if there are terms that are used that are really only familiar in one culture and not so familiar in others. So there's a lot of risks that are involved with these types of questionnaires. And this one, actually, part of my research, I have been applying for jobs just to see which types of assessments are being used. And I have seen some type of assessment being used in at least 50% of the jobs that I've applied for. And this was one of them that I just recently took. So the other risk with that is if you type that very question into Google, you will find that it's word for word, it's out there and someone has already answered it and put that answer on the internet. So there opens up some risk to cheating if you're taking this test from home, applying for a job. People can just Google the question and find the answer. So that's another risk that we have with test taking. Let's take a look at one other option. I think this is another interesting one to explore. And this is on a different type of assessment. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. Let me grab the link for you so that you can take that if you don't have the QR code, but the QR code should be on the screen. And once again, the question is on the screen and the answers are all going to be on the poll. If you have any issues with this at all, please let me know. Okay, I'll give it about 30 more seconds for you to take this. If you haven't already, have a few responses in. Okay, thank you, those of you who have participated. Now, I'm going to ask again before we talk about this one, how did you feel about this question? Okay, I see a few people are answering in the chat box. I see quite a bit of A's, but it could be B, okay. Any other thoughts about the question itself or anything jump into your head as you were looking at this one? I see a lot of A also coming in the answering screen. You should be able to see those as well. Okay. Yeah, Dalal definitely represents how we express our own feelings towards specific situations. And that's exactly what this is trying to gauge. Although it is asking about another person, not necessarily ourselves. Most of the time we use some of our own emotional experiences in order to answer this question. How would I feel in this situation if I was given an extra assignment? It definitely just depends on the person, how they might respond to this, absolutely. I see a lot of A's and B's here in the chat box. So this comes from an emotional intelligence assessment, and emotional intelligence, it has grown in popularity. There are many different types of emotional intelligence assessments out there. This was actually the main focus of my doctoral research, was the use of emotional intelligence assessments in Saudi and Bahrain. And one thing that I found in my research was that for every question such as this, there were about 4 different ways that the question was interpreted by the respondents, meaning not every person reads that situation in the exact same way. The same words might be there, but people have different interpretations of the question itself. And sometimes these differences are slight, but sometimes they're actually such a large difference that the answer to the statement is not really measuring the thing that was meant to be measured by the question. And that's where some of the risks come up with emotional intelligence. Yeah, you answered the way that you would feel in the situation. There's not a lot of instructions here. It just kind of asks the question and you put the response that you think. So that's another risk that we have. If, you know, sometimes the statements are really vague or the instructions are vague, that can cause different types of responses. Emotional intelligence, as many of you likely know, measures different things depending on the type of assessment. Might be measuring empathy or our self-awareness, self-regulation, the way that we interact with other people and our social skills, or maybe motivation. But even those phrases themselves mean different things to different people. You know, our own ability to recognize our emotions, it's actually quite different depending on our background, on our experiences, or our culture. Self-regulation is another quality that differs depending on culture. Studies have shown that in some cultures, the majority of people are really expressive, whereas in others, there's not so much expression. We tend to keep things to ourselves or deal with things personally rather than showing our emotions to other people. So that changes the way that we even see these types of terms like self-regulation.
Hello.
Yes. Hello, yes, I hear someone. Oh, maybe a mistake. So the difficulty, as I was saying, with measuring emotional intelligence is that researchers have actually not agreed upon what actually is emotional intelligence. There's a lot of controversy about that. That also means that different types of measuring techniques are out there. And, you know, most of these types of assessments are self-rated, meaning if we're evaluating ourselves, we're simply looking at our own perceptions of who we are. And we all know that we don't always see ourselves in the same way that other people see us. We're not always accurate about the way that we are. Sometimes, you know, we actually don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. So those types of, you know, self-rating questionnaires can be very problematic. And another thing that I found in my research with emotional intelligence was that some people tend to evaluate themselves. If we're looking at a scale, like a scale of 1 to 5, we might see people tend to evaluate themselves as a 3. They like to stay in the middle. And that's because, you know, they don't want to rate themselves too strongly to either side because they like to leave room for differences in circumstances. And so that can also, that kind of rating behavior can cause a false low score on those types of rating scales. So emotional intelligence in particular has a lot of potential risks if we're using it for hiring or promotional opportunities, simply because the questionnaires themselves, you know, they're different. They're not necessarily measuring the same thing across all emotional intelligence assessments, and self-ratings have a lot of issues as well. I want to show you one more style of question. This comes from a personality assessment, and I'm just going to, just for the sake of time, just kind of point out a couple of things to you here, which is that, you know, a lot of these types of assessment use some type of scale from agree to disagree. And here's where we see some people tend to rate themselves towards the middle, whereas in other cultures, they're more likely to rate to the extreme of agree or disagree. Now, what a lot of these assessment creators will tell you is that the responses are normed, meaning that they're looking at how you rank compared to other people. But most of the time, what I have found in my own personal research is that a lot of these creators of these psychometric assessments have used normed data from North America. Not all of them. There are some that are specific. I know personally when I worked for Saudi Aramco, one of the psychometrics that we used normed us against other Saudi Aramco employees. There was a big enough population within that organization that that company could use only like rankings from that company. And those are a lot closer to being accurate than if we're comparing results from one culture to completely different culture. So we want to make sure if we're using these types of psychometrics that we understand, well, where is the data normed against? Who are you comparing me against? If you say I'm in the 80th percentile, who are those other people that I'm being measured against? And, I found just in questioning some of the salespeople for these types of assessments, they don't always know the answer because the tests were created so long ago, they don't even have the data. They don't remember who those people were, or they were never educated on it. So it's something that we want to take into consideration if we're using these assessments to make those types of decisions on hiring or promotion. The other problematic thing with some of these statements is word choice, intriguing, this phrase, a rough list, or, vibrant. These types of words and phrases, they don't sound the same, feel the same, or make the same sense to everyone who looks at these types of questionnaires. So we may end up getting a lot of different responses that are not necessarily accurate simply because of the way that people are reading or interpreting the statement itself. So I'm going to take us here to just really capture a summary of the risks that we've discussed. With cognitive tests, we have test anxiety that comes up, lack of exposure to standardized tests that might make people, take a little bit longer before they get into the groove of these tests, or before they become familiar with how the tests actually work. We might have different interpretations of the meaning, and we might have some exposure to cheating, as I mentioned with the one that I recently took. With aptitude and personality assessments, I group those together because a lot of those types of assessments are looking at self-reflection, or if it's asking you a question about your tendencies, we might answer in a way that we think is the right answer, but not necessarily is a true reflection of ourselves. I know when I'm taking an assessment and I'm trying to get hired for something, I tend to present my best self. I may not always disclose everything or my faults. We try to present ourselves in a good light when we are trying to get promoted, and that can cause us to answer differently on these assessments. We have cultural biases that exist in questionnaires that, the people who are putting the questionnaire together may not truly understand that those biases are there, which is why it's so important that we do some qualitative research when we're putting these questionnaires together to understand, how are people perceiving this? Is it meaning the same thing to everyone? Is there something in here that makes sense in this part of the world but doesn't make sense somewhere else? We also see a lot of psychometrics that are used, let's say we take a cognitive test and we're applying for a job as a graphic designer. Sometimes we don't see the relevance of the assessment to the actual job that we're applying for, or the task that we will be performing within that job. That means that the tests really are not always as predictive as they claim to be, because, you could answer all the questions wrong, but still be an amazing graphic designer. It doesn't necessarily translate to your skills on the job. One caution that I haven't mentioned yet is in the use of personality assessments. A couple of people mentioned DISC for one. Sometimes those assessments can be a bit limiting. They tend to use labels. You get assessed and you say, I am a D, I am an S. And those kinds of labels can sometimes cause people to say, this is all that I am, I can never change, this is me. And it sort of puts us into a box rather than allowing us to see ourselves as very complex and dynamic. Sometimes also these assessments can cause some confidence issues. If we get an assessment result that's low, we might really internalize that and feel negatively about ourselves, and that can cause some major issues as well. I see some comments here, so I want to just make sure that I'm capturing this. Won't these assessments, so I'm just going up here, red one, won't these assessments lose its purpose if the candidates know the aim behind them? For example, I applied for a DISC, I had to lie just to appear to fit for that position. Yeah, right, so that's the risk then. Now, a lot of these assessment creators will say that they build in protection against lying because they ask the questions in different ways and from different angles. I personally, I tend to agree with you. I think that you could consistently showcase yourself in a different way to try and appear to be the best fit. So I can't speak to all of those assessments. As I said, I'm not an expert in the DISC methodology. I know there's a lot of research out there that has some things to say about those types of assessments. So I would tend to agree with you. Let's see, Mickey Ben Faiza, there is a language barrier. People in GCC would prefer Arabic when taking an assessment, especially personality. That's something that I found in my research as well. I interviewed only English-speaking Saudis and Bahrainis, but there were several people who told me, I speak English fluently, I can take the assessment in English, but when I'm talking about things such as you said, personality, we were talking about emotional intelligence topics, they said, I need to be using my native tongue. And so that can't always be a barrier. Just because the survey is translated doesn't necessarily mean that it's translated in the right way if it originated from the English language. Sometimes we really need to completely rewrite the questions with a native speaker who understands the intention and what's being measured in order to get a really good question. So I would agree with you. What percentage of change regarding the test over time? If you're looking for a threshold or how much change would be normal, it's going to depend on the actual assessment. Some might say, we expect a 10 to 15% change over time, depending on your experiences. Others would say, no, it's going to be within 5%. So that's a great question that you could ask if you're exploring a specific psychometric assessment. Development, in some organizations, they might reject to hire people based on this assessment. Yeah, do they have the right to do so? Yeah, that's a really complex and interesting question. And you're absolutely right. That for me is one of the risks of incorporating these without asking these kinds of questions. If we're working with an assessment that was created somewhere else. I think probably legally they have the right to whatever kind of criteria they're looking for. But morally or ethically, I don't, if I knew that the assessment was not 100% accurate, I would have a hard time making that decision exclusively using that assessment. And these days, what's happening in so many organizations, I can't speak for the way that companies are using it for hiring in Saudi and Bahrain, because I wasn't involved with that. But I know in the US, many times this whole process is automated, meaning you will never even get your CV in front of a hiring manager until you pass these assessments. And so what happens is hiring managers are missing out on potentially good candidates because they are using these assessments that may or may not be accurately measuring the candidate's potential. Timothy, I think it would probably depend on the type. I could say just maybe you don't know the types of answers, but if you've taken a DISC assessment, for example, and it's asking about your strength or the way that you lead or the way that you communicate with people, you might be answering in a certain way about that communication skill or that tendency that you have because you're applying for a job as a leader. You might be answering as if you are that type of person, if maybe you're not, so you may not know exactly what you're going to achieve by answering dishonestly, but you may be answering differently than you would if it wasn't in that context and you weren't applying for a job. That's what I would say to that one. So great comments, great things that have been brought up here. As I mentioned, I am not here for to really try and criticize DISC or any of these assessments. They're just kind of the common ones that everyone knows about. I would say that, as someone who's either using these, interacting with them as a participant, or maybe using them within your organization, consider using these types of assessments in a way that's more of, trying to get an understanding of a person. For example, we use them a lot for team building exercises. Everyone takes an assessment, then we look at these different outcomes, we put people together based on, let's say, their DISC, whatever their DISC letter is. We might put people into groups and have them interact with each other and talk about it. That gives people a chance to clarify any types of, misunderstandings that the assessment might have had. We can talk about our own qualities. We can talk to other people about how they perceive us, and that can really give us, some great self-awareness. And we don't have to use those results as if they're set in stone. Awareness exercises can also be a great exercise, or coaching. You know, you may look at an assessment and you may use it as an opportunity for personal coaching with someone who's asking you questions and guiding you through something. The caution that I'm really trying to show here is about just using anything that comes across our desk, thinking that it is statistically sound or worth using without asking some of these important questions. And I put some key questions on the bottom of the screen here. And these are questions that I personally asked the creators of these assessments, and they can't always answer. You know, I've asked people, how many people have participated from the GCC region? And I haven't been able to get answers from every one of the assessment creators that I've gone to. So that one's important. If we have representation from the region in the data, then those tests are going to be a lot more accurate. If we don't have representation and we're only using data normed in other cultures, we might have some risks. Ask about the methodology. How do you actually determine, you know, how these scores are created, and how do you ensure that these scores or these outputs are valid and reliable? Can you tell me more about that? Those questions are going to get you closer to understanding, is this the right type of assessment for you or for your organization? So those are kind of my final pieces. I know we're getting close to the end of our time here. I have put on this last screen, you know, just a QR code with my LinkedIn page on it. I would love to connect with you if you have any questions. I do, as I said, work with different clients and different organizations, different types of assessment creators that I would view as reputable, and I feel that they are valid in using in the GCC. So if you have questions on things like that, I'd be happy to talk to you. And I just want to open it up if you have any other questions or comments, anything that you'd like to share with each other or with me. I'll open that up now. Thank you so much for your time and for your interaction and all the great comments that were posted throughout the session.
Thank you for this very interesting webinar. I believe we get many new information about the psychometric tools. I don't know if anyone have any question. At the end, we could take one or two questions if anyone has. So if anyone have any question, please raise your hand. Okay, we have one question from Muruj. Go ahead.
Well, hi, everyone. Actually, it's not a question. It's still like a comment. As I said in the chat, that I really feel that people can mature and move from one side to other side of these psychometric tests. So at a certain point, maybe you don't have these leadership skills, for example, but with the knowledge, the exposure, the training, the skills, you will get those leadership skills and become a very good leader. Especially sometimes if you faced a life-changing experience or dramatic change that happens to you. Also, for example, you can move from extrovert person to introvert and like vice versa. So I really feel that I'm not sure if you have studies, you have some articles talking about this specific point that we can go back to and read more.
Thank you, Merj, for that. Yeah, you know, I do agree with you. As people develop, we want to see that, right? If you take an emotional intelligence assessment today and then you start really working on some of these different skills, you should expect to see a change in that score 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Same thing with leadership competencies and things like that. So again, it really depends on the type of assessment. I would say, you know, personality type would be one that would not go to the other end of the spectrum. As I mentioned before, you might see some slight changes in personality. These are what the assessment creators would tell you. But when it comes to competencies or skills, abilities, certainly we would see a greater change if you take those over time, and they wouldn't have that same criteria of being consistent. But I don't have anything specific to share on that one, other than it really depends on the assessment and what's being measured.
All right. So
Okay, thank you very much.
okay, thank you. I saw some in the chat about the record. It will be on our YouTube channel, MARKO Advance. So later on, you could go there and subscribe, and you will see it later. I don't know if Muhammad has a question.
Yes, I have a question. I have a good experience in using psychometric tools. I have used before Hogan, Concentric, Korn Ferry, Discover, and many other assessment tools. And even for leadership assessment, I have used many of these tools. And in some assessments, I found many contradictions between the different tools. Now my question, to what extent this reports and the outputs can be reliable in hiring or promotions? Whenever you find some contradiction between the results for the same person across different, or maybe even the same assessment.
Oh, can I just clarify, when you say contradictions between the tools, are you saying that you don't think they're accurately measuring, or contradictions when you compare them against each other?
Even the meaning, yani in some assessment, you can find that the person is extrovert. In others, the same person seems to be introvert, for example.
So then, can you?
This may create a confusion. And do you know these people? And sometimes you find something different that you are really touching on this person. You see this person is achievement oriented, but sometimes the results of the assessment show something else. And many of these assessments are based on the big five, you know, the big five personality traits, and measuring the same, because they are built on the same personality assessment, like the big five.
Yeah, so the claim would be that these should be reliable across different assessments. So if you take one assessment that's measuring, you know, extroversion, all of your assessments that you take should have the same, unless you're kind of right on the border between two qualities. Then you might see that sometimes you measure it this way and sometimes you measure it a different way. But that is one of the problematic that's one of the problems with these types of assessments, is that they have been criticized for not always being valid. You can't always compare them and the same assessment and get the same type of result. And so that's one of the issues. And one of the things to note is that we shouldn't take these as if they are 100% accurate. Never can they be 100% accurate. That's why we need to be cautious about how we use them if we're making a definitive decision on it. Most people are not going to make a definitive decision on personality. They might be looking for a team fit, you know, should this person go here or here? If we're looking to put people together, we might be using these types of assessments, but using it, you know, I'm only going to hire someone with this personality type. That's not done as commonly, and probably shouldn't be, because it's there are some issues with the accuracy of the assessment.
Okay, that's what we are trying to do. Yani we see this assessment. Is it confirm something that we already know? Is it propose something that we don't know? This is what we are trying to get through the reports of different assessments.
Yeah, well, sometimes the assessment is there to raise your awareness and say, hey, maybe you didn't know this, but this is what the assessment is showing. How accurate is it? And the reason I recommend it's used for coaching is because if you see something on your assessment that says you're an extrovert, but you believe that you're an introvert, you know, that's something you could start exploring. You could start even asking other people. Many assessments have a 360 element, And, that could actually get you some better information than just doing a self-assessment, because other people are evaluating you against the same measures. And that's another great way to see, is this true or is it not true? Am I accurately reading myself, or maybe it's different?
Okay, for the 360 assessment, this is for self-development or personal development plans. And sometimes people assess themselves away from the actual that his peers and managers assesses him. So this is what we call the blind spots. This is what we want to highlight to people.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. All right. So we are now at the end. So thank you very much for this very interesting and very informative session. But before the end, we want your last recommendation for us or for anyone who will watch the recording. And last statement will be with you. So go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just really want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of these insights with you and also learn from you. As I mentioned earlier, everyone in this room has different levels of expertise. And, I really appreciate some of your comments and insights. It's very valuable to me. And I really hope we can stay connected. And, I'd love to attend these sessions that Marco puts on. And with Aymen's, cooperation, I'd love to continue to be involved. So really happy to be here and looking forward to further connecting with everyone on the call.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.